Okay, I'm Barbara Mead. I'm one of the founders of Politics and Prose, and I just wanted very, very much to come in and introduce Stephen Budiansky because that I enjoyed this book so much. I just thought it was such an impressive accomplishment that to write this book, Stephen had to delve deep into mathematics, linguistics, engineering, as well as the technical history of code making and code breaking from those early electric calculating machines that Alan Turing was instrumental about that were used during the Second World War. So much of this is local history, or at least the Second World War part of it is local history, because at that time the NSA was right here on Nebraska Avenue, where NBC is. And it wasn't until 1957 that they moved out to Fort Meade. So in that long history of technology that Stephen had to master, he started with those machines that were manufactured by the National Cash Register Company in Toledo, Ohio. And then so he moved on to digital computing, which is how code breaking is done today. And I have to add that also that he had to become knowledgeable enough about organizational behavior to understand the behavior of the people, mostly talented individuals within the organization of NSA, who very often behaved in a very dysfunctional way. So it was a wide spectrum of knowledge that he had to have, and out of that, out of so much knowledge, Publishers Weekly says about his book, Budiansky is lucid in describing the science and art of breaking complex ciphers. He leavens the history and technology with colorful profiles of cryptographers and spies. The result is a lively account and engrossing history. So that's a wonderful compliment for a book that is so heavy in the subject matter that you need to wade through, but it is truly a lively account. Stephen has previously written 17 books, ranging from such subject matters as biography of the composer Charles Ives, to military history, history of intelligence, science, natural history, and that includes animals, including lions, horses, dogs, and cats. I told him I just ordered his book called The Character of Cats. He's widely versed, as you can see. All this started back when Stephen received his Bachelor of Science degree from Yale and a Master of Science from Harvard University. He has been the national security correspondent and foreign editor of the U.S. News and World Report, as well as editor of World War II magazine. He was also the Washington editor of Nature magazine, and has written for the Atlantic Monthly, The Economist, The Washington Post, and The New York Times. So I told Stephen right before we started that besides enjoying his book very much, that one reason that I wanted to introduce him was that when I was a senior in college, NSA was touring college campuses recruiting prospective employees. And I interviewed with NSA, and two weeks or 3 weeks later, I got a formal letter from NSA offering me a job as a beginning cryptographer. I mulled that over for probably about a month, maybe a little bit longer, but then I turned them down and accepted a job with National Geographic instead. So if I had taken that job, I might have been in Stephen's book. I might have been. but none of that came true. So Stephen's going to tell us about the whole history of NSA over this past, starting pre-World War II, but it's a fascinating history. So here's Stephen to tell us about Code Warriors.
Well, thank you very much.
Give you my
Oh, okay. Great.
so you can
See the time. I'll read all your messages. Okay. That's great. I wouldn't even have to. Yeah. Well, thank you. So in the branch of showbiz that I'm in, which is writing serious books of history, timing is, of course, everything. And in the wake of the revelations of Edward Snowden, which have certainly focused unprecedented attention on NSA, this couldn't be a better time to, I think, spring on the book-buying masses a serious account of code breaking in the Cold War. On the other hand, it probably couldn't have been a worse time to try to research a serious account of code breaking in the Cold War. Back in 1999, when I wrote my book Battle of Wits, which was about code breaking in World War II, NSA was in the midst of, at the time, an unprecedented move toward openness, releasing historical documents, and retired code breakers who had worked on the Japanese and German codes in World War II were thrilled at being given the green light for the first time to speak publicly of their wartime exploits. And were even allowed to go into considerable technical detail about the scientific story behind their remarkable achievements. But in the post-Snowden world, as NSA officials always denote our present moment on Earth, I found almost no one willing to say anything about anything they did at NSA or its predecessor agencies, even during the very first years of the Cold War some 70 years ago. Now, to be sure, relying on the recollections and tales of participants is always a risky business when it comes to intelligence history. I recently reviewed for the Wall Street Journal Max Hastings' new book about secret operations in World War II. And at the start of his book, he quotes the cautionary words of Malcolm Muggeridge, who worked for the British Secret Service during the war before going on to a distinguished career as a man of letters and British television broadcaster. Muggeridge said, "Intelligence work necessarily involves such cheating, lying, and betraying that it has a deleterious effect on the character. I never met anyone professionally engaged in it whom I should care to trust in any capacity." And Muggeridge went on to say that the temptation to embroider and exaggerate particularly goes with the territory. As he rather more acerbically put it, writers of thrillers tend to gravitate to the Secret Service as surely as the mentally unstable become psychiatrists or the impotent pornographers. My apologies to all the spies, psychiatrists, and pornographers in the audience. But, so given all of this, I thought for this book, I'm going to try to tell the story of this more recent period of NSA's history as much as I can, just using the documentary evidence that had been officially declassified and released, combined only with my general understanding of codes and code breaking and computing to help piece together what is admittedly often a very fragmentary public record. There is a lot out there now from the Cold War period, but as anyone who's worked with classified and declassified materials knows, it's a real through-the-looking-glass experience to figure out any rhyme or reason why some things get released and other things remain classified. NSA, for example, still insists on classifying as secret or top secret descriptions of Soviet cipher machines that were last used in 1946, 70 years ago. These devices had mechanical rotors that turned, like the Nazis' World War II Enigma machine. If you own a cell phone, you now have in your pocket an encryption device that is a quadrillion times more powerful and more resistant to deciphering than any of these antique Soviet relics from the early Cold War. And even more interesting, in the meanwhile, some considerably more sophisticated Soviet code machines from the 70s and 80s have actually come on the collector's market, have been purchased by private individuals, have been analyzed and described by academic cryptologists in the open literature. Yet NSA still treats their very existence as secret information. Now, again, it's worth emphasizing that these Cold War era cipher machines are truly ancient history in the technology and practice of cryptology. And I was talking to someone at NSA once, and I said, do you realize 70 years, that's the same interval of time that separates the end of the American Civil War and the start of World War II, during which time a few innovations such as electricity, the automobile, the airplane, and the radio appeared. And you know, the last 70 years have, if anything, brought about an even more sweeping technological revolution in computing and electronics. Okay, another example. For the longest time, NSA stuck to a hard and fast rule that while it might be okay to talk about how we beat the Germans and Japanese in World War II, it was absolutely forbidden to ever breathe a hint that the US had ever listened in on the communications of a nation that it was not actually at war with. And this included even Vichy France during World War II. We couldn't admit we were monitoring their communications, and even Japan before World War II. I was very puzzled in the course of my research for this book when I started reading an NSA study on signals intelligence during the Vietnam War that was released not too long ago. And I saw that they had repeatedly cut out from the declassified version what were apparently references to dates when certain US intelligence gathering operations began in Southeast Asia. And I was wondering, what are these dates and why did they cut this out? Well, a few years later, in response to an appeal that was filed by someone, a less expurgated version of the same document was released. And lo and behold, it turned out that NSA censors had gone through the first time around and carefully snipped out anything that might give away the shocking and highly damaging secret that the United States was monitoring North Vietnamese communications before the year 1961, which was when the first US soldiers actually set foot in the region. Now, if you've ever seen one of these expurgated or so-called redacted declassified documents, it's a sight to behold. They used to have some guy in the declassification office, I think literally armed with a big magic marker, who would go through and cross out anything that was still deemed classifiable. And this, of course, resulted in these very scary looking pages with these big blacked out things. Sometimes the whole page would be completely black and that you'd get. But now, thanks to the wonders of modern technology, they produce these nice, tasteful, whited out boxes with thin, the pencil rules around them. But the result either way is enough to drive a researcher to distraction. You keep thinking, oh, I've got something great in my hands, and then you find every other word has been chopped out, and it's like trying to solve a crossword puzzle created by some demented version of Will Shortz or something. And for a while I kept a collection of some of the more wondrous redacted documents I'd received. There was one, I don't have it anymore exactly, but it was something, there was this one sentence that read something like, blank, cut out, was the most blank sources of blank during the period blank to blank. And I thought, okay, someone worked hard at this one. Okay, nonetheless, I had some small triumphs. Sometimes the same document would be reviewed for release by two different agencies, or even two people in the same agency at slightly different times, each of whom had different ideas about which 65-year-old secret would imperil our nation's security were it to be revealed. So in one report from 1950, the NSA reviewer cut out the locations of US intercept stations that had been picking up Soviet radar signals, but left in the radio frequencies they were operating on. But in another declassified version of the exact same document, another NSA reviewer this time cut out the frequencies but left in the locations. And then there was one historical study from which the declass office had carefully cut out most of the entries from a table showing the numbers of US and British cryptanalysts working on Russian codes from 1948 to 1949. But they left uncensored an accompanying statement in the text describing the percentage increase of some of the missing figures. And this ended up providing two equations in two variables, which I was very happy to be able to put my junior high school algebra to use solving for the unknown quantities. Well, all right, let me speak a bit about what I was able to find out from this Swiss cheese collection of archival materials. Following the great triumph of US and British code breaking in World War II, it quickly became apparent that code breaking and signals intelligence was going to continue to be a crucially important source in the emerging Cold War struggle against the Soviet Union. The paranoia, internal security measures, sealed borders, and extreme secrecy of Soviet society made conventional espionage extremely difficult, if not impossible. Even the most basic facts about the Soviet government's organization, the country's economy, and the military were considered state secrets under Stalin's regime. In the early years of the Cold War, the CIA kept optimistically dropping agents behind the Iron Curtain, and it would later be learned that virtually 100% of them were immediately captured, shot, or played back as double agents against the West. The only thing you're proving by parachuting agents into Soviet-controlled territory, one U.S. Army official told the CIA station chief in Berlin, is the law of gravity. Well, the Soviets' development of their atomic bomb in 1949 gave signals intelligence an even greater urgency, as signals were almost the only plausible source that could detect military preparations within the Soviet Union that might signal an imminent Soviet nuclear attack. The huge challenge the U.S. codebreakers faced in exploiting this vital source was that in November 1948, the Soviets abruptly instituted a sweeping, coordinated change in all of their military code systems. And it was such an unprecedented development that Washington and London briefly feared that this itself was an indication that the Soviets were about to launch a military attack on the West. The new Soviet code systems proved far more challenging than anything the US and British codebreakers had faced before. And indeed, most of the high-level Soviet codes would remain unbroken probably until 1979, when supercomputers and advanced mathematical research produced what one NSA paper referred to as the height of American cryptologic success in the Cold War, around the time of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Throughout the Cold War, at roughly 5-year intervals, NSA brought in outside panels of leading mathematical and scientific experts to review the state of the Russian problem and its possible solutions. And these evaluations are almost nothing but a tale of woe and pessimism. In 1958, a panel headed by the vice president of Bell Labs concluded that, quote, no national strategy should be based on the hope or expectation that we will be able to read. Well, the rest of the sentence was redacted by NSA's declassification czars, but it was pretty obvious it was referring to high-level Soviet encrypted traffic. At one point in the mid-1950s, NSA had 15 special-purpose computers running nonstop for 5 years, searching through 1 million intercepted Soviet messages that had been enciphered with the machine the U.S. called Albatross, trying to find any flaw that could be exploited, and the project ended in failure. Now, incidentally, whatever NSA's successes or failures in breaking Soviet codes, one thing they unquestionably did, and I'm not saying this facetiously at all, was provide a huge stimulus to the U.S. computer industry. The first magnetic drum memory, the first magnetic core memory, the first high-speed tape drives, the first all-transistor computer, the first computer workstation, the first desktop computer, the first high-speed modems, and the first supercomputers were all built to meet NSA contracts and requirements, and only later made their way to the commercial market. Now, one other consequence of this great difficulty in breaking Soviet codes, though, was a reinforcement of NSA's institutional belief that amassing sheer quantities of data could make up for a multitude of failings elsewhere. And this is a credo we've certainly seen in action in the recent controversies over NSA's bulk telephone and internet data collection efforts. Now, this belief in trying to get everything goes back even to the pre-NSA days. It was really striking to to me to come across memos written in 1943, in the midst of World War II, by the U.S. Army and Navy officials in charge of NSA's predecessor agencies. And they were arguing that their job literally was to get everything, to come as close as humanly possible, as one official put it, to collecting every signal transmitted by all those associated with us and against us. Well, this frequently led to NSA simply being overwhelmed with more intercepts than it could receive and even physically store, much less analyze. Even as early as 1955, NSA was receiving 37 tons of paper printouts a month from intercept stations around the world, along with 30 million words a month of more urgent traffic that was sent directly by radio teletype. It was not unusual for NSA's machine section to punch 1 million IBM punch cards a month on just a single problem. And NSA was sending or receiving 70% of all coded message traffic going into or out of Washington. Yet on occasions, quantity could indeed make up for quality. In the aftermath of these 1948 Soviet changes that I mentioned, that shut off the U.S. ability to break high-level Soviet codes, a huge effort was put in by NSA to go through plain language, unencoded cables sent on the Soviets' internal radio telegraph networks. Now, this was a real needle in a haystack effort. By the early 50s, NSA was processing 1.3 million of these messages a month. And of course, as you can imagine, most of them just dealt with incredibly mundane things. Yet, by piecing together details about railcar loadings, coal supplies, lists of bank accounts linked to various state industries, NSA's analysts working on these plain language cables were able to establish the locations of major arms factories in the Soviet Union, produce basic statistics on Soviet steel, chemical, and oil production available nowhere else at the time. And for years, this source provided the only reliable information on the Soviet atomic weapons program and the only reliable set of warning indicators that could signal Soviet mobilizations for full-scale war. And later, reading of plain language transmissions and other types of signals intelligence that did not depend on code breaking, such as direction finding fixes on radars, or even just looking at the patterns of transmissions without even knowing what they actually said. These techniques would allow NSA to offer accurate intelligence about China's imminent intervention in the Korean War, the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956, and the crucial information during the Cuban Missile Crisis that Soviet freighters had in fact received orders from Moscow to stop heading towards Cuba and not challenge President Kennedy's naval blockade of the island. So even without the long hoped for breakthrough against Soviet codes, by the mid-1960s, something like 80% of U.S. intelligence about the Soviet Union was coming from NSA and signals. Now, during the Cold War, a fundamental change was occurring in the nature of electronic spying in another way. It was becoming increasingly the case that cryptanalysis in general, as practiced in the golden era of code breaking back in World War II, was being superseded by what old-timey code breakers used to call second-story cryptanalysis. That is, breaking into an embassy and just stealing code materials or planting bugs. And by the 70s and 80s, it's quite clear from the documentary evidence and that bugging was becoming a primary focus of both the U.S. and the Soviets' signals intelligence effort. In fact, it was such a growth industry for the U.S. that the CIA and NSA both tried to claim the jobs for themselves, resulting in a monumental turf battle. And it was finally resolved when Bobby Inman became NSA director in 1980 and negotiated what came to be known as the peace treaty between the two agencies. Inman, I should mention, was one of the few direct participants in these events whom I was able to interview, and he told me about this episode, and he went on to explain that even after the peace treaty had been negotiated, there were still some problems to be worked out. But for a brief period during the spring of 1981, Inman was serving both as NSA director and as acting CIA director. So he just sent memos back and forth to himself approving his solutions. Never had the two agencies worked so well together, he told me. Well, One of the most important consequences of the late Cold War successes both the Soviets and the US had in bugging each other's communications was that it actually produced a kind of ironic transparency. It offered both sides regular reassurance during moments of tension that the other side was not about to launch a full-scale war. And one former KGB officer later said that the Soviets' bugging of official phones in Washington in this period actually worked to limit the natural predisposition of the KGB toward conspiratorial interpretations of US policy, which is an interesting moral to the whole story. Back at the very end of World War II, one of the leading British code breakers at Bletchley Park wrote a long and very interesting analysis I found in the British archives of the setting out what's going to be the future of communications intelligence in the post-war world. And he began by putting forth the rather counterintuitive proposition. He said that an international agreement abolishing all code and cipher communications would contribute more to a permanent peace than any other measure. This is probably a counsel of perfection, he added. Yet in fighting the code wars to a virtual draw by the end of the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union, I think, found a germ of truth in that idealistic vision. Well, an ironic note is, I suppose, always a good place to end on, so I thank you all very much for coming, and I'd be delighted to try to answer your questions. Thank you.
One mic here, because we have a camera over here. If people with questions could please go to the mic.
I had a chance to look through your book before you started, and you went into some detail about the Walkers and about Ronald Pelton, but nothing about Pollard. Could I ask why?
Well, my focus is on the Soviet Union. That was why. So it was on the U.S. versus the Soviets, and so.
But they were all three. Okay.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Pollard was spying for Israel, after all, right?
We hope.
Yes.
Okay, Stephen,
Yep.
if she can ask a question and repeat the question.
Oh, okay, sure.
Thank you very much. What did you say that under study, economy, and were considered secret matters?
Oh, the question was about what was considered secret under Stalin's regime. It was even the most, I can't remember my exact words, but even the most basic statistics about economic production, the organization of the government, the names and locations of ministries, the names of officials, all of this was literally a state secret. And this effort by NSA of reading plain language, unencoded telegrams, which we were able to intercept, provided an enormous amount of this kind of very basic information about what was happening. The location of arms industries, the location of military facilities, and the whole Soviet atomic program. Most of what we knew at that time came from signals intelligence, which meant these unencoded telegrams. And it was a matter of piecing together tiny things.
During
Yep.
somebody
Nope, go ahead.
during the negotiations for the SALT and START treaties, one of the big things that was able to be a breakthrough was the use of national technical means, which is generally considered to be like geospatial and imagery intelligence. In your research, did you come across anything that would be comparable to that was used as far as signals intelligence as opposed to overhead imagery?
Well, you know, a couple of points there. There was a huge effort to collect telemetry data about Soviet missile launches. And there was a guy at the last NSA history conference a couple of years ago who had worked on this and described, he said the Soviets often tried to hide these signals by putting them very close to television channels, and he was describing the challenge of this. So, I mean, this was clearly a very major part of NSA's efforts at the time. And eventually we had geostationary satellites that were collecting signals, I mean, parked right over these bases in Kazakhstan where this was going on. There was one reference to the fact that we were able to learn, and I can't remember, I think it's in the book somewhere, I'm sorry, I can't remember the detail offhand, but that Kissinger was able to obtain some important information on the Soviets' planned negotiating position on the SALT treaties, which were quite significant in the final negotiations.
Okay, thank you.
Most of your book, I guess, was about Russia. Do you have any feelings about certain events like the South African atomic bomb explosion, or the Indian or the Pakistani atomic
I didn't
bombs?
go into
Do anyone ever admit to that? Is that all still classified? We don't listen to our friends. Or,
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I wish I knew something about that, but that was not in the sphere of what I was researching. Yeah.
I have a question.
Can you just mic? Thank you.
My question is, how does the NSA feel about the big internet providers? Do they use their information as well?
Oh man, I stopped around 1989 in my book almost deliberately so I wouldn't have to engage the current controversies, which are extraordinarily complex. And I'd be the first to say they're extraordinarily complex. Technically, they raise a lot of incredibly complex legal and business questions, and I'm just going to have to punt on that one, I'm afraid. But I know there are many people more qualified than I am to discuss the current controversies over the NSA's and the internet traffic.
Okay, well,
Cool. Thank you.
Stephen.